Imagine coming home after being away for 3 weeks, only to discover that someone had built an entire neighborhood on your property. Not one house. Not two. 25 houses. Fresh pavement cut across the land your family had owned for generations. Streetlights stood where your grandfather once planted trees. Children were playing in a brand new community park. And at the entrance was a massive stone sign that read, Maple Hollow Estates. But the strangest part wasn't the houses. It wasn't the roads. It wasn't even the fact that nobody had asked permission. It was the smaller sign underneath. Private community, property of Maple Hollow Homeowners Association. I stared at that sign for several seconds. Because there was one thing I knew for certain. They had built the entire neighborhood on my land. I slowly drove through the entrance. Every few feet, I saw another reminder that somebody had decided my property was theirs. House after house. 25 in total. Some were already occupied. Cars sat in driveways. Porch lights were glowing. A family was unloading groceries from an SUV. They had no idea. As far as they knew, they had purchased beautiful homes in an expensive new subdivision. But underneath those houses was land that had never been sold. I drove farther. Then I saw something that made my stomach turn. The road had been built directly across the old field where my grandfather used to grow vegetables. I remembered being a kid and walking that field with him. Now there was asphalt covering it. I stopped the truck. For the first time, I realized this wasn't some misunderstanding. Someone had planned this. Someone had surveyed the land. Someone had obtained permits. And someone had decided that my family wouldn't fight back. They were about to learn otherwise. I drove straight to the clubhouse. The building looked like it belonged in a resort. Glass walls. Stone columns. A massive chandelier hanging over the lobby. Behind the reception desk, I asked to speak with whoever was in charge. A few minutes later, a woman walked into the room. Her name was Beth Chambers. She was dressed perfectly. Expensive suit. Designer watch. Not a single hair out of place. She looked at me like I was an inconvenience. Can I help you? I pointed toward the development outside. Who gave you permission to build this? She frowned. Build what? The houses. She paused. Then smiled. This is Maple Hollow Estates. I know what it is. Then you know this property belongs to the association. I stared at her. No. It doesn't. She folded her arms. You're mistaken. I told her who I was. I told her about my grandfather. I told her about the deed. And I told her that every acre outside that window belonged to my family. Beth's expression changed. Not to fear. To irritation. Then she said something I'll never forget. You don't own this land anymore. The next morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox. Certified mail. I opened it at the kitchen table. The first page was titled, Notice of Unauthorized Occupancy. The HOA accused me of trespassing. On my own property. Then came a list of violations. Unauthorized structures. Failure to maintain landscaping. Trespassing. Failure to pay HOA assessments. And finally, a demand for $50,000. I read it twice. Then I noticed the final paragraph. I had 30 days to vacate. 30 days. They weren't asking me to leave. They were ordering me to leave. That's when I put the letter down. Walked into my office. And opened the old metal safe my grandfather had left behind. Because if the HOA wanted a fight over ownership, I was going to give them the one thing they couldn't argue with. The original deed. The safe hadn't been opened in years. Inside were old photographs, tax records, letters, and underneath everything else, a battered leather folder. I opened it carefully. Inside was a document dated decades earlier. My grandfather's original property deed. The paper was yellowed. The edges were worn. But the legal description was still perfectly readable. I spread it across the desk. Then I pulled out a modern map of Maple Hollow Estates. I compared the boundaries. And that's when I saw it. The HOA's property line didn't match the original deed. Not even close. The developer had moved the boundary. And they had moved it directly across my family's land. I sat there staring at the documents. 25 houses. A road. A park. All of it appeared to be inside the original property boundaries. But there was only one way to know for certain. I needed the county records. And I needed them immediately. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. I brought the original deed with me. I wasn't looking for an argument. I wanted facts. I asked the clerk to pull every document connected to my grandfather's property. She disappeared into the records room. 10 minutes later, she returned carrying a stack of old files. We started with the original deed. Then the historical surveys. Then the tax records. Everything pointed in the same direction. My grandfather had owned the property. My mother had inherited it. And eventually, I had inherited it. Then the clerk pulled up the developer's records. That's when things got interesting. The developer had purchased land next to ours. But according to the county records, they had never purchased our property. I asked the clerk to check for any transfer. She searched again. Then she looked at me. There isn't one. I leaned closer. What about an easement? She shook her head. Nothing. What about a sale? Nothing. Any competing deed? Again. Nothing. The county records were clear. Legally, my family still owned the land. But one question remained. How had 25 houses been built on it? I hired a licensed property surveyor. His name was Michael Reeves. The following morning, we met at the edge of Maple Hollow Estates. He brought GPS equipment, surveying tools, and the original county maps. We started at the old boundary marker my grandfather had shown me when I was a kid. It was almost completely buried. Michael cleared away the dirt. Then he checked the coordinates. He looked at me. Your grandfather was right. I asked what he meant. He pulled out the modern subdivision map. Then he marked the original property boundary. The difference was enormous. The developer's survey had shifted the boundary hundreds of feet. Straight through the middle of the development. Michael continued checking the coordinates. One house. Then another. Then another. Every measurement confirmed the same thing. The houses weren't just close to my property. They were sitting on it. 25 homes. The main road. The entrance sign. And part of Hollow Park. All inside my family's original boundary. I looked toward the playground. Then Michael said something that changed the entire investigation. Daniel, there's something strange here. He pointed toward the middle of the park. There shouldn't be anything underground. But his equipment was detecting something. Something large. Michael walked toward the center of the park. I followed. He stopped beside a large grassy area surrounded by trees. He checked the GPS readings again. Then he pulled out another device. This isn't a normal utility line. I looked around. Then what is it? I don't know yet. We walked several more yards. The signal became stronger. Michael pushed aside some leaves. Underneath them was a small concrete structure. At first, I thought it was an old utility box. But it wasn't. There was a metal ventilation pipe coming out of the ground. I looked around. There was another one. Then another. 3 ventilation pipes. All positioned around the same area. Michael stared at them. Whatever is down there is pretty big. I called Andrea Voss, my attorney. I told her what we'd found. She was silent for several seconds. Then she said, "Don't open anything." I asked why. She said, "Because if the HOA built something underground without recording it." She paused. "There may be a reason they don't want anyone to know it's there." That evening, I went back alone. I brought a flashlight. And that's when I found the entrance. I followed the ventilation pipes through the trees. The farther I went, the quieter everything became. Then my flashlight hit something metallic. I stopped. Buried beneath leaves and dirt was a steel hatch. It was massive. And it wasn't old. Fresh concrete surrounded the edges. A keypad was mounted beside it. I wiped away some dirt. There was no sign. No label. Nothing identifying who had built it. I tried the handle. Locked. I stepped back. For a moment, I just stared at it. 25 houses had been built on land my family owned. The HOA had somehow changed the property boundaries. They had demanded that I leave. And now I had discovered a hidden underground structure directly beneath the community park. I called Andrea again. She arrived less than an hour later. She looked at the hatch. Then she looked at me. "Daniel, whatever this is." She pointed toward the concrete. "It was built recently. Can we get inside?" She shook her head. "Not without a court order." I asked her the question that had been bothering me. Why would anyone build a bunker under a neighborhood park? Andrea didn't answer. Instead, she said, "Let's find out who knew about it." The next morning, Andrea and I went through everything. The development plans. Construction permits. Survey records. Property transfers. Environmental reports. Building inspections. There was something strange about every document. The houses were there. The roads were there. The park was there. But the underground facility? It didn't exist. No permit. No inspection. No construction record. Nothing. Andrea leaned back in her chair. Someone went to a lot of trouble to keep this hidden. I asked her what she thought was happening. She pointed toward the original survey. The boundary change came before construction. Then she pointed toward the development plans. And the park was placed directly over the area where this structure was built. I stared at the map. "So you're saying they needed my land?" Andrea nodded. "I'm saying we need to know why." She requested internal communications from the developer and HOA. At first, their attorneys refused. Then Andrea filed a formal discovery request. 3 days later, we received hundreds of pages of emails. Most were meaningless. Construction schedules. Invoices. Landscaping. HOA budgets. Then Andrea stopped scrolling. Her expression changed. "Daniel." I walked over. She pointed at the screen. There was an email chain. And the subject line read, "Property boundary concerns." The courtroom was packed. Representatives from the developer sat on one side. Beth Chambers sat beside the HOA's attorney. I sat beside Andrea. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Then the hearing began. The HOA's attorney argued that the development had been constructed legally. He claimed the HOA had relied on approved surveys. He claimed I had misunderstood the property boundaries. He even suggested that my grandfather's old deed might no longer be valid. Andrea didn't react. She simply waited. When it was her turn, she walked to the evidence table and placed the original deed in front of the judge. "This," she said, "is the original recorded deed." Then she placed the historical survey beside it. Together, these documents established the original property boundaries. The judge studied them. Andrea continued. "And this is the survey used by the developer." She placed the modern survey beside the original. The courtroom became silent. Because the difference was obvious. The lines didn't match. Not even close. Andrea turned toward a large display screen. A modern map of Maple Hollow Estates appeared. 25 homes. The road. The park. Then she brought up the original county survey. The judge watched closely. Andrea overlaid the two maps. The courtroom went completely silent. The original boundary line ran directly through the development. House after house sat on the wrong side of the developer's boundary. Andrea pointed toward the screen. These properties were never transferred to the developer. The HOA attorney stood. "Your Honor." Andrea continued. "The developer did not purchase this land." She pointed to the original deed. "And the HOA has no deed establishing ownership." The judge looked toward Beth Chambers. "Mrs. Chambers, were you aware of this discrepancy?" Beth shifted in her chair. "I wasn't involved in the original survey." Andrea turned toward the judge. "Then perhaps this will clarify the situation." She picked up another document. An internal email. The room became completely silent. Andrea held up the document. This email was recovered during discovery. She looked directly at Beth. "It was sent to you." Beth's face changed. The email was from one of the developer's executives. It discussed the property boundary and the underground facility. But the final sentence was the one that mattered. It instructed everyone involved to keep the underground construction out of the public records. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Chambers, did you receive this email?" Beth said nothing. The judge asked again. "Did you receive this communication?" Finally. "Yes." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Andrea wasn't finished. She presented another document. A construction invoice. It showed payments for the underground structure. Then another. A site plan showing the park positioned directly above it. The evidence told a simple story. They knew the land was disputed. They knew the original boundary existed. And they knew something was being built underground. Yet they continued anyway. The HOA hadn't accidentally built on my property. They had known. And they had hoped I would never look closely enough to prove it. The judge reviewed the evidence for several minutes. Nobody spoke. Finally, she looked up. Her decision was clear. The original deed was valid. The property had never been legally transferred to the developer. The HOA had no ownership claim. The $50,000 fine was dismissed. The eviction demand was dismissed. And the court ordered the developer and HOA to remove the unauthorized structures from my property. But there was more. The underground facility would be investigated. The judge ordered the relevant authorities to determine what had been built beneath the park. And why it had been hidden. Beth Chambers sat completely still. The same woman who had told me I didn't own my own land. Now had to watch the court acknowledge that I did. After months of fighting. It was finally over. I walked outside the courthouse. Andrea followed. She smiled. "You got your land back." I looked toward the sky. No. I said. My grandfather's land came back. Several months later, I stood at the edge of the property again. The HOA sign was gone. The fences were gone. The illegal structures had been removed. The land was quiet. For the first time in a long time. It felt like home again. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the old deed. The same piece of paper my grandfather had protected for decades. I thought about him. About the field. About the house he built. About the years he spent taking care of this land. He never imagined that one day someone would try to take it from his family. But he had prepared for that possibility without ever knowing it. He had kept the records. He had paid the taxes. He had protected the property. And most importantly, he had left behind proof. I folded the deed carefully. Then I looked toward the setting sun. The HOA had 25 houses. Millions of dollars. Lawyers. Developers. Influence. I had an old deed. And it was enough. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't need to be powerful. It just needs to be documented. And sometimes the person who thinks they own everything hasn't bothered to check who actually owns the land beneath their feet. My grandfather did. And because of that, so did I. If you enjoyed this HOA nightmare, make sure you subscribe. Because sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought over houses. They're fought over the land underneath them. And remember, before you let anyone tell you what you own, check the records. You might be surprised by what you find.